let me tell you a little bit about the cataloguing of Mughal coins. Recently I've been getting very interested in Mughal coins, particularly the mint of Ahmadabad and particularly the period of Akbar and Jahangir, though I'm going to be talking about slightly later coins today.
I'm very happy to welcome Robert Bracey, who has this newfound love for Mughal coins. I'm very interested to hear what he says. Robert is currently curator of Asian numismatics at the British Museum, and his interests include numismatic method, historiography, the history of ancient India, toy money, which was an interesting one. The Kushans, of course, you all know that he and Joe Cribb have recently published the definitive catalog of Kushan coins. And now he has this interest in Mughal coins.
I'm going to try and make a general argument for the utility of a particular way of looking at Mughal numismatics. And I think that needs to come with an enormous caveat, which is I am not an expert in Mughal coins. I know relatively little about them. I can't actually read them. I very much, as I know some other people with an interest in Mughal coins do, treat the squiggly writing as if it's pictures and just essentially look for patterns when I'm matching things up. With that caveat in mind that I'm not an expert, let me tell you a little bit about the cataloguing of Mughal coins. The simplest sort of numismatic catalogue, and generally the earliest, are essentially records of collections. And the first of these to be published on the Mughal emperors was that of the British Museum in 1892 by Lane Poole. And this is part of a big push from the 1870s to the late 1890s at the British Museum to try and get all of its collection into a set of printed catalogues to make them accessible to scholars around the world. Catalogues follow for Lahore, for the Indian Museum in Calcutta, for Lucknow. And since then, those are four major, there have been smaller catalogues of Nagpur and of the State Bank of Pakistan. What we don't have, and if you ever develop an interest in Mughal coins and go and start taking a look, is we don't have really a type catalogue. So this would be a catalogue of the sort that Joe and I just produced for Kushans, which essentially lists all of the different types that are known for that empire. The closest thing that we have in print are 3 volumes by Liddell, which attempt to do this for Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. We do have a study of Babur earlier. If you've ever used these, they have some issues. Those issues are not a function of the author. I think they're a function of the difficulty of what the author is trying to do with this coinage. And these can be thought of as horizontal studies, and I'll come back to that terminology at the end of this introduction. It's worth saying straight off, I have not seen any of the volumes of the corpus of Mughal coins of India, which my understanding is now 3 years old as a project and is on 5 volumes. So I'd be interested when we come to discussion if anybody has seen those and if they know precisely what it is those volumes are trying to do, whether or not they're attempting to be a full type catalogue of Mughal coinage. Probably the most useful resource that I found is Paul Stevens' website, which acts as a sort of type catalogue and includes images either available online or which have been provided by Paul himself or by collectors that Paul knows. And it's also worth saying that there are lists of Mughal coins in broader catalogues. There's the Standard Guide to South Asian Coins and Paper Money. There is, of course, Michael Michener's work, which I'm sure people on the call will be familiar with. But overall, I would suggest that compared to many other coinages, especially to coinages of major empires that attract enormous amounts of historical interest, this is actually quite a small number of catalogues. The very few public collections, either major or medium-sized ones, have been published. Very few collections are online. There is no standard type catalogue, with the little proviso I just gave. And there's no Syllogy project, which is standard in English coinage, Parthian, Sasanian, Greek coinage, attempts to make data available on a large scale for scholars. I want to say a little bit about the British Museum collection. This is our online database, a screenshot of it. And right now, there are over 4,000 Mughal coins available on the database with images. And to my mind, a coin is not really available on a database until it has an image. In part because I don't think you should entirely trust us to read the coins correctly. The British Museum collection is not actually particularly exceptional. And why does that matter? And what do I mean by that? Well, the British Museum has 7,000 to 8,000 Mughal coins. It depends on exactly how you count them. That compares with approximately 10,000 on Zeno and something on the order of 20,000 on coin archives. And so that seems very large. And you're thinking, oh, well, that's quite a lot. But I would suggest that there are definitely several Indian museums which have larger collections than the BM. This is not one of those cases where the BM's collection is just so much bigger than everybody else's. The BM's collection is comparable with that of other major museums, and smaller than some, which means that the amount of actual data available just isn't that large, but it's not a function of the coins not having survived. Until 12 months ago, there were only about 400 BM coins available. Almost all the work that's put those 4,000 or so online has happened in the last 12 months, which means that in publications worldwide, you're only looking at something like 25 to 35,000 Mughal coins available. And I think that is why we have not had a good catalogue, good type catalogue of the Mughal Empire, because I think that its scale is actually dauntingly large and it's not immediately apparent. This is a map showing major Mughal mints. Those are mints that made coins consistently through most of the period between Akbar and the collapse of the empire. And as you can see, there's 20 to 30 of these, but there are a great many more. This is an extract from a survey P.L. Gupta did mid-century, in which he talked about the various attempts to list Mughal mints. And those lists came out with numbers between 190 and 230, suggesting there might be as many as 200 mints operating in the empire. Now, in principle, Mughal coinage is not particularly complex. For any particular mint, there's usually at most 4 denominations. There will be a silver rupee, there will usually be a subunit, often a half, there will be a gold coin, the moher, and the mint will also make copper coins, which go by various names, dams, paisas, tankas, but from any particular mint, probably won't be that complicated. And of course, many mints will only make some of these denominations. There they are: rupee, mohur, half rupee, and dam. And in this particular case, all of these, every single one of these coins is from the same year, 1044, from the mint of Ahmadabad. So this is what was being issued in that particular year. However, if you think of that issue by year as a type, you get some quite daunting figures. Here are the various bits. You can see there's two different dates. So on the bottom left of the screen, you can see the Hijri date. On the top right on the mohur, you can see highlighted the regnal year. And because these overlap each other, they don't correspond, there are two dates for each calendar year in the Western calendar. So 4 types. Here's the number we can kind of get to show how big Mughal coinage is. Typically 4 denominations, issued twice a year in the Western system, over 200 years of Mughal rule from 200 mints, would give us 320,000 types. As against, we have 30 to 40,000 published coins. So for every 10 types that exist, we have access to 1 coin if we're studying this. This is an exaggeration. Not every mint is operational every year. Not every mint makes a particular denomination in every year, but it gives you a sense of the scale and how attempting to engage with Mughal coinage from a top-down view, which is how we would engage with something like the Guptas or the Western satraps or the Kushans, an ancient dynasty, can get you into problems. And it's very much this that I think if you read Liddell's attempts to do this, you will see. He's trying to see the whole empire in one go and divide and see the coinage from that perspective. And it's just too big to do that easily. So I'm going to suggest that we ought to take an alternative approach to Mughal coinage. And I've certainly found it productive in developing an interest on this and needing to do research on the BM collection to take this alternative approach. It's not a new one. In a review of numismatic literature in 1961, P.L. Gupta pointed out that one of the very first things that people did was attempted to look at the coins in terms of a particular mint. So he points up 4 studies by Taylor and a study by Brown, where they chose a particular mint and just worked on that mint. He says enthusiasm in this direction appears to have ceased at the time. Now, it isn't 100% true. There is an article in John's where Shailendra Bhandari does this for the Maratha period at Ahmadabad. Excellent article, really good, shows the value of focusing in on a narrow period and a single mint in order to try and sort out what's going on. Having given that background of the cataloguing of Mughal material, I'm going to talk about my terminology. What is a vertical and what is a horizontal study? And this derives from me looking at silver coinage in the medieval period in England, where there are some similarities. You have a widely distributed set of mints, 40 to 50 different mints operating in England, and there's a degree of central control. And you can look at those mints in 2 different ways. And studies of this type are very popular in English silver coinage. One of them is to look at a particular type. The types are sequential under each king, and to look across all the mints and see how they vary. And the other is to look at one particular mint and see what happens over time. And so I refer to these as horizontal, when you look across the coinage at a particular moment, and vertical when you cut down by looking at one particular mint over time. In English medieval coinage, you can change between those two quite easily because there's very firm central control. So when one mint issues an arms and scepter type, every mint issues an arms and scepter type. That isn't true to the same degree for the Mughal Empire. There is clearly much more independence on the part of the mints, though there is a strong degree of central control. And that means that for the Mughals, I don't think horizontal studies, and I'm not saying this entirely blindly, this was what I attempted to initially do when I first looked at Mughal coins, that horizontal studies are very practical. They get you into a mess very quickly because you can often only understand a particular coin by understanding the coins that came immediately before or immediately after at the same mint. So for the Mughal Empire, I think vertical studies work better. And I think they're necessary because the scale of Mughal coinage in total is just so vast that attempting to grasp the whole thing in one go is often just wildly impractical. And I'm going to illustrate here one of the simple problems with lists. So a very common way of tackling Mughal coins is to essentially show one coin and go, most of the other coins look like this, but they have different dates on. Here is a list of the dates that appear on them. This coin has the Hijri year 1102, which is partially offline, or I think technically actually partially covered by one of those little encapsulation rings up on the top right of the obverse on the left-hand side. And the regnal year 34, which is on the right-hand side of the reverse. The problem with this particular coin is this coin was issued from the mint of Surat. That appears at the bottom, or enough of it to recognize, because you can see the T at the end of Surat appear at the bottom of the reverse. But when it was put on an auction site, it was listed as an Ahmadabad mint coin. And the problem here that creates for lists, if you're simply listing, is I have not seen an Ahmadabad rupee with this date combination. So in a list format, this would create a phantom, a type of coin which can't actually be demonstrated to exist. Ahmadabad might have made coins with this date combination. I've just never seen any. And you get this problem very commonly. Paul, on his website, you can see is dealing with it all the time, where the numbers just don't quite make sense, that he's finding in other people's lists, and he has to leave notes saying, I've never seen a coin like this, it might not exist, it might be a misreading. Now, one of the things that arranging stuff into vertical studies, working on a particular mint does, is it makes the coins amenable to a die study. And when I kind of was working through the title that I gave to Pankaj, this was one of the points I was making in the title. Taylor did this because he needed to physically get hold of coins, and it was much easier to do that if he concentrated on one mint at a time rather than trying to work on coinage generally. And I've just suggested that it makes the coinage much more amenable because it's so large. But the other thing that's happened is when Taylor wrote those mint studies, people didn't do die studies. The first proper die study to be published, the first proper die catalogue, was in 1906 by Kurt Regling. And it was the first time that somebody demonstrated that you could execute a die study on a coinage and find enough coins to make it a realistic prospect. Something which had been openly doubted by Hill at the British Museum just a few years before. So this is a chart from the last talk I gave, which concentrated on those issues which have month names on, so can be dated very precisely from Ahmadabad. And I will need to explain what the color coding means. For each type, that is, each specific month of issue in the rupees, I calculated on average how many coins we had per die that had been identified. This is called an index number. It's used to indicate how complete your sample is. If the number is 1, it means that your sample is not very complete at all. If the number is over 4, it generally means that your sample is very complete. And it led me to something that was a conclusion at odds with the existing literature. In the existing literature, the general assumption is that the zodiac coins, you can see an example of Jahangir's zodiac coins. This is a silver rupee issued from Ahmadabad. Ahmadabad only makes zodiac coins in silver. It only makes them for the first 5 months of 1027. The assumption in the literature is that upon Jahangir's death, zodiac coins were recalled, melted down, and removed from circulation, and that as a result, they are extremely rare today. However, that statement, which you will find repeated in many places, is untrue. In auction catalogues, the Ahmadabad's zodiacs are the single most common types issued from that mint under Akbar or Jahangir. They are about 5 times more common than any particular date in the Elahi coinage of Akbar. And we know this because it was relatively easy to simply look at the number of dies that I could find. And it was also fairly apparent once I started actively collecting data for Ahmadabad, because I ended up with my folder, which has about 5,000 images in it, absolutely stacked with zodiacs. Die studies allow us to look at vertical studies of particular mints, and say potentially interesting things about those mints. This illustrates Ahmadabad under Aurangzeb. There are basically 4 types, and they all look largely the same. The initial type has the mint name at the top of the reverse instead of the bottom. The subsequent types differ in where they position the year, but otherwise they're. And die studies of these are very easy once you've sorted them, because you can, first of all, organize everything by its date. So that gives you a type. So these are 3 consecutive types of rupee at the Ahmadabad Mint, starting 1079 for the Hijri year and regnal year 11, then 1079 regnal year 12, and then 1080 regnal year 12. And then you can simply die study a relatively small group. You essentially just need to look at your earliest obverses with the year 1079 on and assign them numbers, then check your later obverses and assign them numbers with some large increment to separate them unless the same die is used, and then do the same for the regnal year 12 reverses, and then on to the next year. And you can do your die study as a series of links in a chain, but any particular bit of it only involves dealing with a relatively small number of coins. That works very well for Ahmadabad. It turns out it's significantly more difficult for Surat. So the thing that I did in the last 6 months between talking to the ONS about Ahmadabad and now was to also begin a vertical study of Surat, which is located near Ahmadabad and is frequently talked about in the general literature on Mughal coins in terms of the relationship between the two mints. You can see on the left-hand side, we have a 1069 year one. So year one is rarely done as a numeral. It's usually just the characters add, meaning first, and then beneath it a 1070 and then add. On the right-hand side, we have a coin where we can see the add, its regnal year one, but we don't know if it's 1069 or 1070 because the date is right down on the bottom left and it's off plan here. And it's normally off plan on these coins. And what we hope by gathering enough of them is that you might detect some way of working out which coins are early and which coins are late. So which ones are 1069 coins and which ones are 1070, even though you can't see the date. It does superficially, when you first look at these coins, look like there might be a pattern, and that maybe in the center of the coin there's a 5-dot pattern on 1069 coins and a 2-dot on 1070. But looking at enough of them, turns out that's not true. There are regnal year 2 coins that have the 5-dot pattern. It's not, however, hopeless, or you do find patterns like this. This was one I found for Ahmadabad in the Ilahi years 45 and 46 under Akbar. For a period of just 6 months, the mint introduces these control marks that look like a leaf or a knot and only uses them for 6 months, never uses them before again. So it's very common on these coins not to be able to read the full date. But if you've got the control mark, you can attribute the coins quite accurately. So I'll reiterate this for anybody who's not familiar with Mughal coins. I know I've said it once already. There are, on most Mughal coins, there are 2 dates, the Hijri year and the regnal year. And the two of them, those two systems do not align. They overlap each other. These are issues of Aurangzeb from the beginning of his reign at Surat, and they have the dates 1070 ad, so 1071, and 1072. And that's the normal practice. And the same happens for the next year, but they shouldn't be these dates. So here they say 1071-3 and 1071-4. I've enlarged to the left of the coins where the 3 and the 4 are. So you can see what those look like. And let's put them next to it. You should never get this situation at a Mughal mint. If 1070 is regnal years 1 and 2, then 1071 should be regnal years 2 and 3. If 1071 is regnal years 3 and 4, then 1070 should be regnal years 2 and 3. In this particular case, I think it's fairly clear what's going on. Aurangzeb actually comes to power in 1068, at the very end of 1068. 1069 should be years 1 and 2, but the mint, for some reason, doesn't get round to making coins until 1069, so it treats it as the first year and the beginning of 1070 as the first year, and then it obviously corrects its error when it changes the type in 1071. Whether the change of type is associated with new instructions that clarify the regnal years, or whether it's associated with new personnel who are just better at making the calculation, is unclear. But I illustrate it here because I wanted to make the point that sometimes it's the coins that have the wrong information on them, not us misreading them. And that makes the problem even more difficult. And it only really becomes apparent when you're looking at enough of them. And I say that because in lists, I found all the possible combinations of years here. People thinking they can read a 1073, people thinking they can read 1071-2 on a coin. So again, it's a reason why we don't trust lists. We want to look at particular mints. However, there are problems with vertical studies. This is Ahmadabad and Surat on a map. For anybody who doesn't know where they are, they're quite close together. They are widely assumed to have serviced the trade that comes in through Gujarat and the west coast of European silver. So there's a widely held assumption that European silver is arriving in ports on the west coast and it's being turned into Mughal coins, and thus the need for highly productive mints in this area. As with many things in Mughal coinage, that is often stated as a fact, but it would be more accurate to call it a reasonable assumption, which is as yet unproven. Now, the problem with a vertical study, of course, is that every conclusion that I draw, everything that I say, only applies to the thing that I'm working on. It's only true for Ahmadabad. Ahmadabad is not the only mint to make zodiac coins. So it might be true that Ahmadabad coins survive in significant numbers, but it doesn't follow that coins from Agra, Kashmir, or other mints that made zodiacs also survive on a relatively large scale. You only get a very narrow picture, and that means there are certain things you can't easily tackle with a vertical study. This is an image of Nur Jahan. Nur Jahan is exceptionally famous because there's a big argument around Nur Jahan about exactly how much power she had, but whether or not she functionally usurped Jahangir's rule over the Mughal Empire and became effectively empress. And one of the things that it revolves around is the fact that coins have her name on them. However, that's often done simply by looking at catalogues. People will write arguments that say Nur Jahan wanted to advertise her growing political power and she used it to put her name on coins, and they'll reference a catalogue that says Nur Jahan's name appears on a coin. These are consecutive years from Ahmadabad. I think any user of the coin would immediately recognize that these are different types. However, if you were under the impression that the name on the front, Jahangir's name has a quite distinctive sword-like swoop in the center of it, which I'm now highlighting, to illustrate that the two names you see are not the same. The coin on the left says Jahangir, the coin on the right says Nur Jahan. I would forgive you for not realizing that those are two different inscriptions. I certainly wouldn't be able to read that just from my basic command of the letters. I'd get into exactly this sort of problem of thinking those same codes. And I think most people who used them probably thought they were. However, there's very little useful I can tell you about Nur Jahan's name appearing on coins from just Ahmadabad, because it happens at a lot of mints, but it doesn't happen at all of the mints. What you would need to understand this is a horizontal study. You would need to look across all the mints at this period and work out why some mints did include Nur Jahan's name and why some others didn't, and how those things varied. So this is an example where vertical studies don't work well. I think I've made my central argument that we should, if we're interested in Mughal coinage, go back to this idea of looking at particular mints and trying to track them. And you can, if you want, the videos of my previous talks about this are online, so you can see some of the additional detail that I dragged out there. It's an extremely productive way of looking at Mughal coinage. I want now to momentarily look at Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb is the successor. He deposes Shah Jahan, who is the son of Jahangir, the king who is maybe being usurped here. And I want to look at what it was that originally drew me to Mughal coins. I've written 2 articles about this, and I remember many years ago pulling Mughal coins out of the trays in the British Museum and finding it absolutely fascinating that the edges of the rupees are marked. You can see 2 types of mark here. This is a coin of Sher Shah. This is the beginning of the rupee coinage. This is not technically a Mughal emperor. The Mughal standardized coinage is not actually created by them. It's created by one of the people they're fighting with. You can see, surrounded by circles, Peck marks on the surface of the coin. These we know are used to test whether or not the coin is really the metal it purports to be, or whether it's been plated or gilded or surface enriched. But there are also, enlarged around the edge of the obverse, marks on the edges, which I will refer to as schroff marks. We don't know who made them, we don't know why they're made, but it's useful to have a terminology to distinguish between different things, and I call these schroff marks. And these absolutely fascinate me at the time. Apart from anything else, the possibility that you could say something about the coin that wasn't about the moment it was minted or the moment it was deposited in the ground, because all of these things happened when it was in circulation. And this coin is effectively carrying something on the order of 20 modifications, probably all made at different times. They're not the only type of mark on Mughal coins. There's also what I would call chop marks, by analogy with the extremely collectible Chinese silver trade dollars, where they're which have their own little magazine and lots of very active collectors. A chop mark is different from a schroff mark simply in that it occurs on the obverse or reverse rather than on the edge. And this coin here has 5 different chop marks on it. And as I said, I've written a couple of articles, one in the Festschrift for Joe, which focuses on Peck marks, and one for Chop Mark News that looks at examples of chop marks in the British Museum collection. And this was initially what I was interested in. I didn't initially expect to want to do studies of mints or even to do die studies in the Mughal coinage. I initially wanted to look at these marks and try and understand those. And I realized I needed a solid background against which to put the coins that were marked. And back to the introduction, I very quickly felt that absence of a standard type catalogue in Mughal studies. Because there's really basic questions. Other people have looked at these and gone, these are very interesting, but we don't have answers to very basic questions. Which of these practices comes first? Are they heavily localized? What are they used for? Does the practice change over time? To give you a very simple disagreement, my intuition had been that schroff marks as a practice are earlier and that chop marks as a practice are later. When I spoke to Shailendra Bhandari about it, the first time I gave a talk on this subject, he thought it was the other way around. He thought chop marks were an earlier practice and that schroff marks were a later practice. I'm now going to be able to suggest something, or at least I'm going to be able to show a difference and then illustrate why it's so difficult to work out what's going on. Here is a coin with 8 Peck marks on it, issued in the reign of Aurangzeb from the mint of Ahmadabad. I have only seen Peck marks on coins from Ahmadabad. I can't speak to schroff marks because edges of coins are not usually photographed. You have to examine the coins in person for that. But I've not seen chop marks on Ahmadabad coinage. However, in doing a similar vertical study for Surat, which remember is very close to Ahmadabad and is widely believed to be servicing the same inflow of silver, I have seen chop marks. But first of all, I need to say the marks on this coin's on the reverse of the two on the left-hand side and the obverse of the one on the right-hand side, the big round impression. These are not chop marks. These are a different category of mark. Again, these are counter marks made by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company at Colombo. The marks are made roughly contemporary with the coins. I didn't work this out on my own. One of the auctions that these were in just happened to note it, so I was able to look it up. A countermark is different from a chop mark in that a countermark is issued by a political authority in order to allow the coin to circulate. That doesn't seem to be what the chop marks are doing. Both coins, both with and without them, appear to be able to circulate. I'm going to show you some examples from Surat Mint under Aurangzeb that have chop marks on the surface. They also have peck marks. So this one has a very clear peck mark on the obverse, but it also has two chop marks. And the difference between a peck mark and a chop mark is a peck mark is simply made with a spike. There's nothing identifiable about it. And the assumption is that it is basically just to test the purity of the coin. A chop mark would be less effective at that because it won't penetrate as far into the surface and it's identifiable. So one assumes that its identifiable nature is part of the point of putting it on. Though since we don't really know what they're for, that's at best a guess. This is another example. You can see a cross and a petal design. The petal design is very interesting because I've seen now quite a few coins with these petal designs on. So it's not clear whether they were used in a lot of different places or if there was some particularly prolific marker that used them. This one's a little more complicated. One might suspect that those square designs with Nagari characters in might actually be countermarks rather than chop marks. They might have been issued by a political authority. Very hard to tell. I've not seen them elsewhere. Another example, this time with two on the reverse. There might be one on the obverse, but the coin's not in great condition. An example with crosses on both sides. They're similar enough, makes you wonder if they were made by the same people. Here is an example, nice example that shows the peck marks and the schroff marks both on the same coin. There are 3 chop marks and 3 peck marks. The really interesting thing here is that I've now seen quite a lot of these from the reign of Aurangzeb. I have seen no example of a Surat rupee earlier than Aurangzeb that has a chop mark on it. And I've seen no examples from Ahmadabad of Aurangzeb's reign that have chop marks on. So this appears to be a difference between Surat and Ahmadabad. The problem is something I tackled in the last talk I gave about this. It's the counting problem. I can count those up and go, oh, yes, I've seen these for Surat. I've not seen them for Ahmadabad. And I could then try drawing a conclusion. I could say, oh, well, the practice started in the Surat area before it started in the Ahmadabad area. The problem is exactly the same issue I have with people who try to do that to work out the production of mints by using coin hoards, which has been very common over the years. And I illustrated just really isn't sound reasoning the last time I spoke about this, because quite simply, the coin hoards are not a random sample of the coinage that existed. And the material I have is not a random sample of the coinage for Aurangzeb's reign from Ahmadabad and Surat. Maybe the difference is between the samples, not between the two coinages. And that is where I ended up in the dye studies, because the vertical studies and then the dye studies of the vertical studies are what allow me to evaluate whether or not the two coinages I'm looking at are similar. And the answer in the reign of Aurangzeb at Surat and Ahmadabad is they are not. Ahmadabad coins survive in the trade in extremely small numbers under Aurangzeb. They're very common earlier, but under Aurangzeb, I've virtually never seen a dye identity. The sample is so bad, I'm not seeing coins from the same dyes in that reign. Whereas for Surat, I do. The Surat sample is much better. And the reason for that seems to be to do with hoards. And this is just a bit of fun. This is sometimes known as the Taj Mahal hoard or the Great Barrier Shipwreck. And we get lots of dye identities for 1113. And the reason is that about 2,000 of these coins were discovered in a shipwreck. And the famous thing about the shipwreck is that Arthur C. Clarke was involved in it being raised up. Most of the coins are still in lumps, but a large number of the coins have been cleaned and separated, and they have made their way into the market. And when you examine them, you find dye identities. There are more Surat coins of this period available. And of course, the possibility is that there are more Surat coins available because there is greater demand for them, and that therefore people are willing to accept coins which are in worse condition. They either come out of a shipwreck or they've been chop marked, which is often seen in the trade as devaluing the coin. And therefore, I'm seeing the marks because Surat coins are more common, not because the practice started earlier at Surat. I just thought I'd finish with images of the Taj Mahal hoard, which I think is quite fun, and also make that point and tie it back to how I originally got into this. I'm very interested in trying to understand the various markings on Mughal coinage, but in order to do so, I need to establish a good sense of how complete our samples are and the ways in which they are distorted by both survival and collecting practice. Questions like the one that Pankaj and I were discussing in the middle: were zodiac coins recalled effectively? Are they more or less common than their equivalents? Questions like that impact the interpretation of the marks we find on the coins. And that's why the dye studies become necessary, and the dye studies require the vertical studies. But I would generally argue that the studies of mints, isolating particular mints in the Mughal period and tracing them over time, is an inherently useful thing that generates potentially valuable historical data about how the mints operated, and more importantly, how the coinage was used, understood, and impacted by political, economic, and social events in the Mughal period. And it's an approach to Mughal coinage that I think we should get back to. We have tools today that make it even more valuable than it was in 1900. We ought to encourage other people to look at it in that way.
So as a beginner with Mughal coins, the only way I have to attribute them is by looking at the dates, which, as you said, are often off-plan. I wouldn't even know which mint I was necessarily looking at when I look at a series of coins. How would you even begin to get started if you don't have a large selection of coins to look at? I don't read the script either.
So I had exactly the same experience as you. As a beginner, my initial attempt was, I'm going to look across them, and I almost immediately ran into, I've got no idea which mint's which, and the date keeps being off. So initially I did Ahmadabad,
Okay.
And as I explained in a previous talk, that's because the possibility of doing Agra was just completely daunting. And Ahmadabad comes first in the alphabet of the major mints after that. And I pulled them out. And what I found was somewhere between 2 and 4% of Mughal coins that you pull out of auction catalogues and Zeno are misattributed. They're either the wrong mint, or they've read the year incorrectly, or they've guessed at the year and got it wrong. But once you're dealing with a few hundred coins over a 5-year period, then you begin to see, oh yeah, there's a critical mass for the die studies. And I reached this for Akbar's Ilahi coinage, where the unit is usually off flan, where I've got enough coins where the unit is on flan that if you give me one that's off flan, I've got a 50% chance of matching the die. So if I simply go through and look to match the die, I will eventually be able to locate the coin to the correct place. Now, that was kind of my hope under Aurangzeb, and it was a bit of a surprise, having had those sorts of levels under Akbar and Jahangir, to discover, oh no, there's just nothing here. So that bit at the beginning of Surat, where most of the dates are off flat, most coins you cannot see if it's 69 or 70. I've got 3 or 4 coins where you can see it's 69, and 3 or 4 coins where you can see it's 70, and I think 20 or 30 where you can't, and there just isn't enough data to pull those 20 or 30 in. But if you get enough, if you get a good enough sample, right, you can begin to do it by die. Even before you get to that level, the misattributed ones stand out. Once you begin to sort things and you've got 1079 early, 1079 late, 1080 early, and you're kind of scrolling through them, when you hit one that's misattributed, it kind of immediately goes, no, I'm in totally the wrong place, because you're flicking through, looking on the left-hand side for the date. And then you get one where the date's at the bottom, and you're like, no, you are in the wrong place, because at this period, the dates are on the left-hand side. They're not. So I can't even read the date, but I know you're in the wrong place. And then you can go, you belong much earlier or much later. And so it becomes, that's why that sequencing becomes so valuable. It's also why I almost entirely talked about rupees. The first thing you learn is how bad our published sample of copper is. It's like, in the rupees, you're finding die identities in a lot of places. That doesn't happen in the copper. The copper just isn't published. The gold isn't consistently made in the way the rupees are, so you can't easily do the same thing in the gold. And a big warning, the types in gold don't always synchronize with the mint's production of silver. So sometimes in the gold, they'll change the arrangement, and it'll take them a year or two before they do it in the silver. Certainly that's something I've encountered. But very much by focusing vertically and just running through one mint, the fact that 95% of the time people who've been working on this do attribute them correctly gives me a backbone against which I get my eye in. The misattributed ones jump out.